Great. Hello everyone. My name is Carlos Carnicero Urabayen. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and this is another talk for Future is Blue, the weekly newsletter promoted by Agenda Pública and Funcas Europe. Today I'm joined by Raimon Torres, Funcas Europe Director, and Clara Volintiru, Associate Professor in the Department of International Business and Economics at the Bucharest University of Economic Studies. So thank you both for joining. And the first question I want to ask you is about the recovery fund. There's been a lot of talk about this fund, and it seems that the Commission now has to present a proposal about the specifics of this fund. So I want to ask each of you, what are the key elements that this fund should have so it's effective to fight the COVID-19 crisis? Raimon, would you like to start?
Okay, hello. It's a pleasure to share this conference with all of you. And the first element that the first condition for the fund to be successful, of course, has to do with the size of the budget, the fund. And at the moment, there is a lot of ambiguity regarding the precise funding we are talking about. Some people talk about 1 trillion euro, other people double that sum. This is between 7 and 14% of EU GDP, so it varies quite significantly. In any case, it's something of that magnitude. If it was around 10% of GDP, it would more or less match what the US is currently doing. So it would be significant in that sense, and certainly by historical standards. The second key factor has to do with the timing. It's actually perhaps even equally or even more important, because the recovery fund is supposed to be associated with the EU budget. So in other words, it will only be activated next year. Some people say at the beginning of the year, but more likely mid-2021, and this would be too late because the fund, the recovery fund will be needed actually in the third quarter of this year. So anything that can be done to advance spending would be very important. And of course, the third condition has to do with the nature of the intervention, the nature of the program. Is it a series of loans to countries, or is it actual cash which is provided to countries, especially those most affected by the crisis?
Okay. Clara, do you agree with Raimon's element? Raimon mentioned size, timing, nature. Do you agree with that, with those elements?
Absolutely. I think those are the most important elements, the most important variables, if you wish. I would only add the idea of rules. This has been one of the most stringent aspects of the multi-annual financial framework negotiations in the last couple of years. How will the funds actually get to the member states, and further down, how will they get to the beneficiaries? So far in countries like Romania, for example, we have seen European funding from the past cycle being heavily used to mediate the effects of the COVID-19 crisis. For the moment, European funding has been reallocated to be used in guarantees for small and medium-sized enterprises, will continue to be used for technical unemployment payments. So we have seen, even before the EU Recovery Fund being enacted, we have seen European funding at play. Now, interestingly enough, many national governments do not promote it so heavily as European funding as they do label it as national measures. So many times the end beneficiaries do not really know if the funding comes from the EU budget or not. But coming back to rules, I think it is important to be accessible for all member states and for different type of beneficiaries. And one very important point here, many of the persons who will need funding are not very well versed in the Brussels technocratic language. For example, local governments. Some of the local mayors in small municipalities, not even municipalities, small communes, sometimes don't even know English. So you really need to make sure these instruments are accessible to them, because they are the most affected by the current crisis.
Okay, so key rules and clear rules so that the fund is effective. One element that is controversial about this fund is that some states, especially in the south of Europe, are saying we need grants, we don't need loans. So Raymond, why is it so important for these member states that this fund is giving them grants and not loans?
One has to realize that countries, some countries in Europe are heavily indebted already. And on top of that, the country policies which are mentioned by Clara, the measures which are adopted by countries now will add up to the existing debt. So for example, in the case of Spain, but I think it's more or less the same for all European countries, public debt may increase by up to 20 percentage points of GDP already on current trends in the next 2 years, in 20 and 21. So if the program is a series of new loans, it means that countries really have to assess whether it makes sense to take up additional debts as opposed to do something else. So, and in addition to that, the countries in question, the most indebted countries, they are worried about the risk premium on their debt. So in other words, if there is more debt, it may aggravate the cost at which they place bonds and other treasury paper in the markets, and therefore their financial costs may increase, in a way neutralizing any positive effects coming from the European program. So they are right to be concerned about that. On the other hand, pure grants are criticized by some, especially surplus countries, those like Netherlands and some others, that made efforts before to reduce their debts. They are criticized on the grounds that it would be a pure transfer to countries which were not careful enough in the sense of managing their public budgets. And so this is the situation now. We have two different, quite, I would say, opposed opinions and views about these. And this is one of the stumbling blocks in the negotiations at the moment.
Clara, do you agree with that? Do you agree that it's important that this recovery fund has an important component of grants?
Listen, I think this has been around before the COVID-19 crisis, the debate of whether we should have grants versus loans. And we saw this divergence of opinion with the negotiations for the multi-annual financial framework. And we saw the Invest EU project, the former Juncker plan, that was mainly constructed to deliver loans, not grants, as opposed to how the funding used to work in regional development sort of projects. Again, I feel that there is a severe risk for new member states with weaker institutional capacity to make use of such instruments. But I would like to also point to the fact that public debt has increased in a context of developmental divides. So many of the Central and Eastern European countries or southern member states have had serious, let's say, needs to cover, whether in terms of recession or in terms of infrastructure investment. So the public debt was not only this type of corrupt, lack of discipline sort of narrative, it was also need-based. One more issue about the public debt is the fact that it will very significantly affect national policies in terms of fiscal remedies, tax breaks. So if the public debts would have been lower, then national governments would have had more space to mediate the effect of the COVID-19 crisis at the moment, which they don't. And again, for countries in Central and Eastern Europe who want to make full use, I'm thinking of Bulgaria, Romania, who want to make full use, Croatia maybe, of the Eurozone mechanisms, having an increasing public debt will severely affect their chances to adopt the euro currency in the future. So there are considerations to be had beyond the immediate, let's say, bonds versus grants versus loans or guarantees. It's a question of how will they be placed in the multi-speed Europe in the future.
Talking about public debt, one of the concerns that there is on the table is whether this public debt it can get quite huge in some cases. If this public debt is going to be paid back is there a real concern in that regard, Raimon?
Yes, it's a big question mark. I mean, will it ever be paid back somehow? And if so, how? Really, there's no rationale for repaying all that. As Clara said, and I completely agree, that serves future generations if it's used properly, of course. So that in order to invest, in order to modernize your economy, improve social cohesion in your society. There are a number of social protection. We see the importance of health today. The countries which are best placed tend to be those that did invest before in their health system, and some had some overcapacity in a way. So there are numerous reasons why it may make sense for governments to get indebted in a way. But of course, when it goes beyond a certain threshold, it poses a number of risks, and perhaps we are in this situation today, at least in a number of European countries. I think there are various options here. One would be to try to repay the debt through higher taxes. Clearly, this may be very difficult at least in the foreseeable future because of the recession. And there will be, of course, a lot of resistance to higher taxes. There may be some case for a surcharge on top income. Some people are suggesting that, or a special tax on enterprises. I rather think that one should step up the efforts to make sure that taxes are properly collected. There's no tax evasion and so on. That should be, in my opinion, the first priority. But I doubt that taxation will be enough to reduce debt. So the other way is what somehow there was an attempt to do that before in previous years after the financial crisis, which actually led to a kind of a second fall in the crisis, is through cutting spending aggressively, is the austerity strategy. And here we know the lesson from the history shows that this could be counterproductive, in fact. Another way would be to simply drop part of the debt, to simply not reimburse part or part of the public debt. That is easy to say, more difficult to do, because if you do that, you must make sure there are no new deficits, because if you have still in deficit, you must place your new bonds into the market. And if you at the same time cut debt, of course, nobody will buy them, or with a heavy discount. And so there is a final option, which I think is interesting. It would be to consolidate somehow the purchases of public debt which are presently done by the ECB, and make this a much more of a permanent feature of ECB policy. And of course, one has to be careful not to go overboard, because it could be a monetization of debt, which would lead to some inflation concerns, according to some. I think they are exaggerated, but still. But yet, to make it a permanent feature of ECB policy, that would be one way perhaps to deal with the matter in the future. But of course, overall, one has to keep in mind that no debt is sustainable without economic growth. So the top priority now is renew economic growth. And that's the top priority. And then we have to worry about that later on.
Clara, would you like to react to that?
Yes, obviously, I think this is a great opportunity to push forward the European project, because any form of concrete action in the sense of risk mutualization or burden sharing would be actually a step forward in the actual construction of the European Union from the economic point of view. Not only economic, actually, pushing it forward to what was intended to be a fiscal union in the end. So there was a lot of discussion on the Corona bonds. Obviously, at the moment, the idea is not floating as well as some would have hoped. Now, the idea is based on the balance of powers. And it's always the countries that have to pay to foot the bill that will resist it. And at the moment, Germany is in that position, well expectedly, because Germany has been the economic agent of the European Union, and it remains to be seen to what extent is it willing to take on this massive political burden at home. because it has to sell such risk mutualization across Europe to its constituents who will contribute to this common payment. Now, I would like to point to the fact that Central and Eastern Europe has had much higher growth in the past years than the rest of the Eurozone. And when we are talking about the economic recovery, the one we are all hoping it will kind of ease or show that these measures are can be well supported. Now, the V-shaped recovery that the IMF is hoping for is judged by the growth rate of the Eurozone, which has been much smaller than that of Central and Eastern Europe. So what I'm trying to say is that even in the best case scenario, the over 4% GDP growth next year, Central and Eastern Europe would still be in technical recession. It will be at a much lower threshold than the rhythm of growth it had in the past years. So once again, these effects have to be mediated because if they're not, the European project might collapse under the burden of disenfranchised citizens.
All right. Thank you both. I think this was very interesting. And of course, we will continue this conversation and keeping a close look at how the EU is responding to this huge challenge. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.